This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thanks very much for coming. First seminar of the 2015-16 term. I won't go into detail now about the spring term, since we're only just starting the autumn one. We have got quite an interesting spring term being lined up. I'm very pleased to have Merilyn back. She's spoken before, and I think it's attended quite a few times over the years, but asked particularly to come and speak about a book which hopefully many of you have already got and perhaps read, and if you haven't, you'll have an opportunity at the end to acquire one, Breaking the Silence, about refugees coming to Britain fleeing from Nazism, but a particularly appropriate subject in some ways given the current situation, which I guess we may touch on in discussion, but that's entirely up to you. But let's hear first of all from Merilyn. So Merilyn, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm first going to talk about this book, which is in fact about the children of refugees from Nazism, and then at the end I'm going to try to sort of draw comparisons, but feebly, with today's refugees. Oh yes, please do shut the door. Yeah. I'm also going to be kind of referring rather a lot to what I've written, just because the whole subject makes me quite nervous. While research has been done on the 1930s refugees from Nazism, little research has actually been done about the children of the refugees and about their experiences. And the aim of my book was to listen to tell the stories of the children of refugees, the second generation, how they saw their parents. It's not a book about the parents. It's not even a book about the children's view of the parents. So that's the first thing. My original intention, and this is why speaking here is the right place, was to compare the children of actively anti-Nazi parents with children whose parents had fled because of anti-Semitism. And I wanted originally to see whether that made a difference, whether having political parents made a difference to the children. In fact, it didn't work out like that. To my surprise, I found out that many of the parents of the participants were what I call softly political. I didn't choose them because of that, but in fact what then turned out, softly political as a cause of escape, what turned out is actually that people who were political, you won't be surprised to hear, were more likely to spot what Nazism was about and to get out. In fact, the group who got out were not just communists or even social democrats. A whole group of literati people, famously like Toller and Brecht and Weil, and also business people got out as early as 1933. What I also discovered is that the parents who fled to Britain because they belonged to the Communist Party, that's the parents belonged to the Communist Party, either became apolitical or went back to Germany or Austria to contribute towards, as they saw it, the building of a socialist society. My parents actually are the exception to this. It does not apply to them. The KPD parents of two of the three participants, while they had their children in Britain, had then returned to Germany, one to the east, one to the west. These two interviewees then returned to Britain as young adults. The third didn't let me use his interview. I couldn't find anybody whose parents had been Social Democrats. I assumed they had generally gone back. And I did find somebody whose parents, for those of you who are interested in these things, had belonged to Neue Beginnen, but they didn't want to be interviewed. So, what I have amongst the participants, where the interviews are included, is a spectrum. At one end are the two people whose parents were not at all political, who are from Hungary. who fled because of anti-Semitism, through a number whose parents fled because of their soft left politics and anti-Semitism, to the 2 people, 3 including me, whose parents fled exclusively for political reasons, even if 2 out of the 3 would have been categorized by the Nazis as Jewish. And I refer to this last group, of the parents who were active members of the KPD for this audience as the children of cadres, because we understand what that means. My interest was in the children of refugees whose parents arrived here as adults before the outbreak of war, so this does not include the Kindertransport. I succeeded in finding people using what is aptly called an opportunistic sample, whose parents came from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Very few people arrived in Britain from Poland before the outbreak of war, and I did not include them. But if I had, I suspect they would have represented a different constituency. The parents of the people I interviewed did not generally see Jewishness as a key characteristic and did not have a community already living in Britain to become part of. And I suspect the refugees from Poland were more likely to define themselves with their Jewishness and would have joined existing communities. So I am not claiming that this is a representative sample. 2 more caveats. The sample is entirely middle class. This had not been my intention, but I think it's probably partly because of the professional character of the majority of the refugees. The second caveat is that 3 of the women I interviewed refused me permission to use their material, leaving me with 3 women, 3 men, and we'll go back to that later and we can discuss it if you want to. I also want to say that writing this book hurt. In fact, talking about it is difficult. I mean, this is a book about a very emotional subject, and I've discovered that people I know have had very strong reactions to it. I mean, people say to me, "Oh, do you have to go on about the past? Oh, come on." And another reaction I get is, "Oh, well, what's so special about your experience?" So, I mean, this subject seems to create a sort of a lot of emotion. My most unexpected discovery from the interview was the importance of the murder of grandparents by the Nazis. This applies to the people who were defined as Jewish, but that was almost, not completely, the whole sample. The parents of the interviews had remained largely silent about what had happened to their parents. Their children, the second generation, had grown up feeling there was something terribly wrong, but not knowing what. Of course, they had never known their grandparents, but many felt haunted, but did not know by what or why. While the refugee parent knew at some level what had happened to their families, the second generation did not even know what there was to know. As Peter said, and a lot of these are pseudonyms, as Peter said, the sentences my father used about my parents, his parents, in the first 30 years of my life amounted to no more than 5 minutes. In my interview, I said that I felt as a child I was living with ghosts. I suspect I was picking up on my parents' unspoken, unspeakable grief for their dead. Even when, as was the case for Tom and Tanya, the respondents initially assured me their parents had talked to them, as the interviews progressed, it became clearer that there was still much that had not been said. I want to make a few suggestions to explain the silence of the parents towards their children. The parents of the refugees had mostly been murdered, but when the refugees had fled, they had expected to return and to see their parents again. Many did not realize what had befallen their families till after the war. Some, such as my mother, gave up on finding out about the fate of their families. Nothing would bring them back. The refugees felt that they had deserted their families and could find it excruciating to revisit or talk about them. The parents' silence may also have been a feature of mourning. Words cannot bring back the dead. Silence may also in part be a product of the exile's inability to integrate past and present, of having lost a part of the past self. Kitchen argues that the refugee's sense of dislocation contributes to a sense of fracturing, which in turn is associated with an inability to talk about the past. Maybe for some, the silence was an attempt to protect their children and leave them with hope. That is certainly what some of the parents would have said. So the line of memory was cut. There were no grandparents to tell their stories, no place to visit where grandma had grown up, no family recipes. One extreme example was Mike, who only by accident discovered his real surname after his mother had died. He told me, upset, that he could never have found out about his dead family if he hadn't found out his real name. The second generation respondents grew up dispossessed from their own past at the same time as they were haunted by the ghosts of the past. Rosenthal argues that the less the parents tell their children, the more sustained the impact of that past on the second generation, and the greater their grief for the unknown dead. Why did the respondents not insist on getting answers from their parents about the past? Rosenthal argues that families often in effect prohibited or blocked questions by the second generation child. The interviewees read their parents' reaction accurately. Excuse me. Thank you, Irena. Peter said, where am I? Wait a second. Peter said, whatever sentences he, his father, uttered about the past, he said in a way which made you feel he did not want to continue. That really, really discouraged you, however much you may have wanted to try to take him to those zones. If you are met with such a curt answer, if you look at the body language of somebody who really seems to be saying, I don't want to go there. Some of the interviewees also didn't want to give their parents pain by asking questions about taboo areas where their parents had already suffered so much. Asked whether he felt in some way responsible for protecting his father, Mike replied, protecting him, that's his father, from the pain of reliving his past or his losses, absolutely. But late in life, some of the respondents had deep regrets. Robert repeatedly lamented in his interview that he had not asked his parents more questions and condemned himself for colluding with his parents' silence. But Peter argued against this complicity. He said, there is such a power relationship involved between parents and children. If some sort of authority figure gives out the message they don't want to go into that space, that they feel desperately vulnerable, then I think that in the moral sense you're not in the sphere of complicity. Sometimes late in life, the participants' parents had opened up a bit. Mike said, a few years before his father died, he showed us family postcards from Auschwitz-Birkenau, written in camouflaged language. The time was up. I'd never seen them before. It was revelatory but very painful. Many of the testimonials suggest both a profound concern for troubled parents, as well as a resistance to parents desperate overprotectiveness and emotional anxiety. I wish my son were here. He'd recognize this. Tom talked about his father's massive overprotectiveness and constant fear that something bad would happen to Tom, which Tom felt deeply constraining. Robert experienced his mother as cripplingly overprotective, those are his words. She was always telling him what to do and not to do, which he found suffocating and very intrusive. In my parents' case, as I stated in my interview, somebody interviewed me, which is included in the book, overprotectiveness had got seriously laced with paranoia. I said, I wasn't allowed to have friends. I wasn't allowed to have girlfriends. I wasn't allowed to have boyfriends. That world, that little cut-off world, absolutely edged with paranoia, obviously affected me and, did not increase my sense of self-worth. Relationship with parents were generally not close. The failure of parents to talk to their children about what had happened in the past, in effect, meant that the door to communication generally was closed. Peter said, "We were not an intimate family. We spent a very limited time together, and they were mostly painful moments." Peter brought out the connection between his father's behavior and his father's exile. "Both my parents were extremely emotionally needy. My father because of his vulnerability, because of his loss and being a refugee, wanting the world to be predictable and under his control." What Tom said was fairly typical. "My relationship with my father was quite a painful one. We fought a lot about a lot of things. He wasn't physically brutal at all. He was emotionally, basically without knowing it, very manipulative. He was a guilt tripper. How can you do this to me? When you're young, how do you know you're right? A lot of aggro, a lot of pain and struggle involved in my relationship with my father." Tom had tried to overcome his antipathy and to understand his parents, especially his mother. He said of her, she couldn't quite engage emotionally. She was 24. She had to leave her country very, very rapidly. She had to leave her parents behind. She lost her whole world, and as it turned out, her parents too. Peter showed deep compassion for his father. He said, "When it is your family that have all perished, I cannot get inside what that must have been like for my father. There's some kind of black hole in the trying to empathize with what it was about. I couldn't rescue my father from that. There was nothing I could do." But at the same time, Peter was aware of the cost to himself. He said, "I felt I had to rescue my father at an emotional level. I think I felt I didn't have permission just to think about myself, my own needs, my own psychological difficulties. Keeping him afloat," that's his father, "felt a duty. I suppose I internalized some of his need to be protected, and my not having a right, that the level of emotional difficulty could never be comparable." Sorry, never mind. Peter was certainly not alone in feeling a sense of obligation to please needy parents. One unexpected consequence of being the child of refugees is how many of the respondents were bullied. Accent was a mark of difference. In a horrible twist of history, being the child of Jewish refugees often became synonymous with being German. In a period after the war of strong anti-German sentiment, Sarah said. The girls at school had said, "Miss, you don't speak English properly." I mean, these are people who were born in this country, yeah? "Miss, you don't speak English properly." And others said, "Miss, you're ugly." A lot of anti-Semitism at the time. This is her speaking. A lot of anti-Semitism at the time. People did not think of me as Jewish. It was the anti-German feeling that affected me. Henry said, "It's more than fear. It's the laughter at my accent. I had a recurrent nightmare when I was at primary school, which was that I was trying to speak to people, but they couldn't understand me. I was screaming and nothing came out. That did actually happen to me. People said they couldn't understand what I was saying. If they did, they laughed at me because I talked in a funny way." And when parents picked up their children or visited their schools, they also talked funny or looked different. Tom said, "I remember being quite embarrassed by my father at having quite an expensive fur coat and speaking with a definite Austrian accent. That's how I defined it. I remember being embarrassed by it." So at an early age, second-generation children often felt different. Almost all the interviewees late in life had felt compelled to try to find out what had happened to their grandparents, whom they had, of course, never known. But this search for grandparents was emotionally costly, and at least one respondent suggested led to his being seriously ill afterwards. So there's more in there. Tom recently found the details of his grandparents on the web. He said, "I felt like I'd cut myself. Somebody's talked about mutilation, much stronger than I wanted to be. I didn't want to know they went to XYZ concentration camp, too strong. I could understand exactly where my mother didn't want to find out. It just makes it more real." For families with a settled history, photos provide a way of remembering and commemorating the dead. But for the respondents, photos were inevitably few and their role contradictory. Mike said, showing me a photo, in fact, he rushed in and was the first thing he did. That's the only picture there is of my family. That's the only tangible memory his father, had of his murdered relatives. Peter said, my father had pictures of both his parents by his bedside. We were told nothing about them. It was symptomatic of the confusion. What could be more important than having those photos by the bedside, but you know nothing about them? Tom found he could not bear to look at the photos he had, which he kept hidden away in a drawer. Even when he didn't know who the people in the photos were, how he was related to them, or what they were called. As Mike said, we have never become familiar with family trees. One issue which there isn't the time to go into was that the respondents appeared to prefer their fathers to their mothers. My supposition, so did I actually, my supposition is that in the 1950s and early 1960s, when most of the second generation were growing up, there was an expectation that it was the mothers who provided the emotional sustenance. Yet the respondents' mothers, who I must emphasize generally cared passionately about their children, did not have the emotional reserves which the children wished for. Indeed, the depression of their mothers were often alluded to by the participants, which wasn't helpful. Tom said his mother felt she had become invisible. The respondents' fathers, on the other hand, had all succeeded in finding jobs, and I suggest were seen as conforming to a male stereotype, even when they treated their children quite brutally. Gender also pops up as an explanation for why so many of the women I interviewed refused to let me bring their interviews. In the interviews, all three of the refuseniks had expressed mild criticisms of their mothers, which I suspect they couldn't bear to be made public. As Wardy documents, second-generation daughters find it hard to separate from their mothers. I want to now digress into the thorny field of transferred trauma. I didn't know whether to cut this bit out, but then I decided to keep it in. So just bear with me. One inspiration behind my book was to critique the idea of transferred trauma and of victimhood, which so many in the second generation identify with. While most of the interviewees had successful professional careers, at the same time, many identified, this is the respondents, identified issues of greater anxiety, lower self-esteem, and more troubled personal relationships and difficulties in bonding in their adult lives than they would have expected. A few of the respondents expressed a loathing of their bodies or revealed a preoccupation with death. Tanya, who denied any concept of transferred trauma, provides an example of how our parents can affect us. She said, "My mother was always sad and my father sighed. You absorbed that. It was the repetition, the reinforcement. When I was a little girl and I would wake up to a new day and life was so exciting, then I would go to the kitchen and my mother would be sitting there and would greet me with, 'Today so-and-so would have been so old.'" One explanation which is offered is that of transferred trauma. This is not a coherent theory, but it's just as that the trauma the refugee parents experienced is transferred onto their children, even though the children did not themselves experience trauma. Sometimes the trauma of the parent is categorized in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's no better. The unresolved grief of the refugee parents is transferred to the child. The parents' inability to grieve for their dead leads to the child grieving instead. Transferred trauma has hit the headlines of late, which is partly why I've mentioned it, in a biological rather than psychological form, with the media coverage recently of the work of Rachel Yehuda. This suggests that post-traumatic stress disorder among Holocaust survivors can be transferred through epigenetics to their children. Perhaps someone here will afterwards explain to me what this means, because I don't understand it. But basically, it is argued that genes can be altered through experience of fear or persecution, and that this alteration can then be transferred to the child, making the child who hasn't experienced the trauma more liable to anxiety. This is an approach which sees the social as taking on a biological form. We know the dangers of this position. And I'm not going into it, but at a minimum, I think, one always has to emphasize the importance that any transference takes place and is mediated by social circumstances. But to return to the psychological version of transferred trauma, as those of you who've read my book know, I'm very critical of this. Some of my objections are based on so many different things, but there's a lack of agreement about what it means. And, some of these academics, they say it's to do with parental communication. Very much actually, in a way, what this book's about, the lack of parental communication, how parenting took place, class, it occasionally gets a mention, very rarely, the importance of Jewish heritage, the nature of parental flight, whether it was traumatic or not, how many people were murdered in the Holocaust, even the exact year the child was born. The distinction between whether parents fled for ideological, political reasons or for survival is hardly ever considered. When it is, there's no agreement. Yehuda argues that, in fact, people who went into hiding or fled for political reasons are as traumatized as people who survived concentration camps, which is alone quite an interesting little detail, that flight from persecution for political reasons could yield as much trauma. But Hans, who is another psychologist, less well known, but I liked him, he argued the opposite, that resistance leads to a greater sense of self-worth. And similarly, Kitchen suggests that the act of resistance had allowed active anti-Nazis to maintain a less fractured self. And I think trauma has to be experienced. I'm not saying that parents don't affect the child, because that's obviously nonsense. But I think that transferred trauma really does ignore historical specificity. And it defines the second generation too much and what has been done to them. And as Judith Butler highlights, the use of trauma, the concept of trauma, threatens to turn the traumatized into the helpless victim, at the same time as actually demeaning them. One must also beware of pathologizing responses, seeing them as sort of not quite normal, which actually may be quite protective of the second generation person. And I think it's much better if one really talks in much more specific terms about people's pain, loss, suffering, dislocation, and of course resistance. To move on, many of the respondents did have unresolved issues over identity. All but one of the respondents had come from what the Nazis would have understood as Jewish backgrounds, even though in all but 3 cases their parents had been secular atheists, and Jewishness was not an important part of the parents' lived existence. Before the second generation, anti-Semitism had contributed to their parents' flight and caused their families to be murdered. The respondents, all of whom had themselves experienced either soft or hard anti-Semitism, expressed a deep unease about what Jewishness meant. Again, there was a spectrum from the one person, Henry, who unambivalently defined himself as Jewish, through Robert, for whom Jewishness appeared to erupt unbidden in his later life, through Peter, whose definition of himself as Jewish was exclusively a political statement against anti-Semitism, to Sarah, who saw the emphasis on Jewishness as crap. The parents of that was her word, not my word. The parents of the second generation also generally had wanted to discourage identification with Jewishness in the UK. Peter said, "It would have been the last thing my father would have wished for me to feel Jewish. He wanted us to escape from all that. He himself had converted to Christianity while not denying his own Jewishness after the war." Like all but one of the other respondents, Peter was not circumcised. In fact, there was one guy just didn't dare ask. So, it may be that none of the respondents were. He said, "My brother and I were not circumcised. It's classic about the ambivalence of it. He insisted, that's his father, insisted when we were bathed of pushing our prepuce back so as to make it look not quite as if we were circumcised, but that we wouldn't look like Gentiles either. It's wonderfully illustrative of this kind of incredible ambivalence. You deny being Jewish for the sake of your children, but you can't quite let it go either. Robert's testimony also expresses some of the complexity. He said, "When I was about 9, I got beaten up, not terribly badly, by the little Irish boys, as I called them, for being Jewish. Bloody German, we won the war. I'd say, I'm not German, I'm Austrian. And then they'd say, bloody Jew. So when we left Kilburn and moved, my parents said, don't tell anyone we're Jewish. Don't even tell your younger brothers you're Jewish, because they're too young and they'll let it out." There was also little identification with Britishness, but this sense of dislocation is something I'm going to return to. I want to return to the importance of resilience and agency in the construction of identity. This leads into the issue of the differences or spectrum between the respondents with CADA, political and non-political parents. The children of the CADAs all explicitly rejected the label of victim for themselves or their parents, such as Tanya and John. Instead, they expressed pride in their parents in a way which distinguished them from the children of non-political parents. This was extraordinary, actually. The respondents who had non-political parents did not appear to recognize the bravery of their parents implicit in flight. They tended to see their parents as the objects of Nazi persecution. They were not protected by their parents' resistance. Anybody here who has attended a second-generation meeting will know how frequently those attending return to aspects of their own victimhood. Indeed, John was one of the respondents who explicitly stated that's why he didn't attend. The children of CADAs, on the other hand, knew that their parents had chosen to take on the Nazis for political ideological reasons, and it gave them strength. Nevertheless, against expectation, the CADAs had also kept silent and didn't talk much to their children, even if, except for my parents, they were slightly more informative. Why? In line with Gradvold's argument, I suggest the need for secrecy in the anti-Nazi organizations of the 1930s encouraged a culture of silence which stretched well beyond the defeat of Nazism. This was certainly the case in my family. Moreover, as many here will know, the British government in the 1930s didn't want to admit communists. MI5 thought communists were even worse than Germans, and king forbid if they were also Jews. Even once admitted, many, like my parents, were spied on by MI5, and a few caught in so-called political activity were actually expelled, basically to their death. In addition, in a period of anti-communism after the end of the war, at a popular as well as a governmental level, parents who had been close to communist organizations were less likely to want to draw attention to themselves, and ideas which had become marginalized and may well have felt reasonably paranoid about the state. MI5 kept records on my mother until into the 1950s. Crucially, even if they no longer had an allegiance to the Communist Party at an organizational level, if they maintained a belief in the future possibility of socialist transformation, they would not have wanted to give succor to anti-communist attitudes by giving voice to their disquiet or disillusionment with what the communists had done in the 1930s or afterwards. On the other hand, if they had moved to the right politically, as Sarah's father had, they may well not have wanted to remember or even to discuss their past political mistakes. Moreover, although there certainly were exceptions, many communist fellow travellers didn't believe in giving themselves emphasis. I mean, the emphasis was on a class analysis. I want to end this section by discussing the importance of dislocation because of its connection to present-day refugees, which is where I'm heading. By the way, I don't have any idea what the time is.
You're doing fine.
Thank you.
No problem.
Dislocation, which has sometimes been called the immigration effect, has an impact which can be understood as independent of trauma, though it's often lumped into transferred trauma. This audience may hesitate over the importance given to roots, but there was so little left of the past for the respondents who felt displaced. No family, sometimes not even a place to go back to, it just disappeared. No connection to their parents before they had arrived in Britain. No stories. Even when members of the extended family had survived, as for Robert, they had ended up far away in the UK or elsewhere, and that didn't provide support. The respondents had to reconstruct a past from thin material. In my book, I talk about second generation identity terror, the unknowingness as to whom one is, a sense of not living in one's own skin, not feeling life as one's own, of being in exile from oneself. Ironically, the absence of a connection to the past for many of the respondents later in life increased their sense of having no choice but to find out about that past. The respondents also stated they didn't feel English. This was not because they were socialists or rejected nationalism. Although born in Britain, England, everyone talked about England. The respondents generally did not feel this was their home. Neither did they identify with their parents' country of origin. Robert called himself a Central European. Tom stated at one point that he was a relic of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Good historical sense. Though he later modified this by emphasizing how nonsensical it is to deny the influence of English culture. He used the word English, not me. Robert, Tanya, Sarah, and John all called themselves outsiders. Sarah said, "You never fit in. I always felt like an outsider. I was born here, but I never feel English. I'm a rootless cosmopolitan." There is, however, a probable difference with today's refugees. This is where I'm slowly moving into the final section. The refugees from Nazism didn't generally wish to return home, except for the cadres, at least most of them. What was there to return to? Today's refugees, we can hope, may still be able to return to a home. And I want to end at the beginning. People probably here know these figures, but I'm going right back to the 30s just for a moment. Between 1933 and 1939, 60 to 80,000 refugees who escaped Nazism were allowed into Britain. The greatest number after Kristallnacht, the pogrom of November 1938. A mere 9,354 unaccompanied children, the Kindertransport, were admitted in the last year before the Second World War. Given how much, you'd think that was 90,000, the way the publicity goes, but it was 9,000. The government and the Jewish Council made it very difficult for people to get in. Although the 1930s government was more liberal than the Jewish establishment, and I will defend that, government policy was a product of the government's and the Jewish establishment's belief that too many refugees could incite anti-Semitism. Just notice the resonances here. Too many refugees could incite anti-Semitism, the desire for the refugees to become anglicized, a concern the refugees should not live off the public purse, and the reality of unemployment. Next sentence is very carefully put. How far the government's reactions were based on anti-Semitism is contested, as today is the degree to which Islamophobia informs the present government's decisions. But another similarity is that as now, the government were taken by surprise by the generosity of civil society. It was the Quakers, the trade unionists, and the left who organized to save and take care of the refugees in the 1930s. And as today, they had abuse piled on them by the media and the right. Still, only approximately 10% of those who applied to come in here were given the right to enter, 10%. And I guess most of the others perished. This is not a fine humanitarian record, but does outshine the present government's offer of 20,000 over 5 years. Moreover, these refugees are to be drawn from refugee camps on the Syrian border, and disproportionately from orphan children. not from the refugees already in Europe, including Calais. This government's extreme anti-refugee position is evident in its use of language. Cameron, who was Prime Minister, not some maverick right-wing Tory MP, was using the language of migrant crisis and swarms. The talk is of migrants, not refugees, certainly not asylum seekers. The suggestion is clear. Migrants are causing a crisis. The Home Secretary, in her appalling speech last week, basically said she wanted to close the door on migrants. The government even uses the word multiculturalism as an accusation, reminiscent of the Nazis' use of cosmopolitan, then an easily understood code for Jews. Without wanting to over-egg the similarity, theirs is the Tories is the language of difference, othering, and dehumanization, which the Nazis developed to an extreme towards the different groups they saw as inferior. We need to draw attention to the unrecognized state violence being done to the refugees through the government's indifference and their policy of exclusion. The overwhelming difficulties created in reaching Britain are reminiscent of the 1930s, when Britain all but closed its doors and the US was even worse. Then 2 Jewish refugees were referred to as illegal immigrants, and there was talk of saturation. Even if a refugee, that was the 1930s, even if a refugee does somehow get here today, the complicated and generally obscure procedures the refugee is subjected to is as bad as the dehumanizing treatment of the 1930s refugees. In fact, actually, I wonder if it's not worse. No, the Tories are not Nazis, but with their narrow majority, they're attempting to create an enemy without, against whom they can appear as the nation's saviors. And rather than confronting UKIP xenophobia, they roll over before it. Cameron's position shifted from the beginning of August into September after the photos of the drowned Syrian boy appeared. But what also caused a modification in his narrative, however feebly, was the unexpected popular support the refugees received. Almost 1.5 million signatures were collected within days on an e-petition, "Refugees are welcome here." And a recent survey has shown about 12% of the population have been involved in actively supporting refugees. At least, we need to confront the government's political priorities and continue to argue refugees are welcome here. We need to specifically demand that the 4,000 to 5,000 refugees in Calais are allowed immediately into Britain. I shake as I witness the refugees willing to risk their lives and their wish to stay alive. As I see the refugees walking their way, this is where I'm going to cry, goodness. As I see the refugees walking their way across Central Europe, I think of my father, you see, dodging the police and the Gestapo. As hunted for his anti-Nazi activities, he walked across Germany in 1933. My parents' political refugees were the lucky ones, part of the 10% allowed into Britain. They survived, I was born. Yet as the book shows, Nazism's brutality and the dislocation it caused has shadowed the lives of the respondents with melancholy, the lack of a sense of belonging, insecurity, fear, and an abiding sense of being haunted by the ghosts of the past. Breaking the silence is so called because almost everybody I interviewed said it was the first time they had broken the silence of their parents. Sarah said she had waited all her life to talk to somebody like me. There is no way that being a refugee can ever be easy, but I hope today's refugees and their children, if they settle in Europe, do not feel they are outsiders and feel the need to remain silent, but that is partly down to us. Thank you.